Hey friends, today I'm super excited to bring you learning problem solving. If you're someone that has trouble moving past tutorials and doesn't know how to turn their ideas into code, this is going to help you a lot. You can read the post if you want, but I created a presentation so it's more interesting to watch. So welcome to learning problem solving.
What would you do with a brain if you had one?
Do? Why, if I had a brain, I could while away the hours, conferring with the flowers, consulting with the rain.
So let's get a brain, right? Like the scarecrow from the Wizard of Oz. Do you feel stuck? You maybe tried every course and tutorial, but things don't click together for you. You can't make anything on your own and you feel lost, but don't worry, there's a cure. So the problem with most tutorials is they really steal the opportunity of learning from you. They basically do the thinking for you, right? It's like wanting to exercise and get buff, but you're watching someone else go to the gym instead of you going to the gym, which doesn't make sense, right? But it's really weird how we don't apply the same logic to programming. So problem solving and critical thinking is a skill you have to practice outside coding. In the immortal words of Bob Ross, talent is a pursued interest. Anything that you're willing to practice, you can do. Take it away, Bob.
While I'm doing that, one of the most interesting things that we see as we run across the country teaching this fantastic method is people continually say, I can't draw a straight line. I don't have the talent, Bob, to do what you're doing. That's baloney. Talent is a pursued interest. In other words, anything that you're willing to practice, you can do.
And that's right. Think about the problem. Everything is a problem if you think or not. So don't stare at a blank canvas. It would be like the equivalent of an artist staring at a piece of blank canvas and expecting to make great art. You might think that's what happens, but usually artists, they have limited resources, right? Maybe they have expensive paints, etc. So first they would sketch out the idea and think about it for a long time before they apply it to the canvas, right? That just makes sense. So you should also stop and think about the requirements. You can sketch your ideas on a piece of paper using a pen, right? Or you can use something like CrazyJaZz, which is really awesome and I love using it. So let's think of the requirements of a to-do app. I used CrazyJaZz to make this sketch, and before you reach for code or anything, you should just relax a bit and just think about what you're doing, right? So you can literally sketch this really quickly. So if we see here, we have a simple input, what needs to be done, and we already know the first requirement. So we need an input field, and maybe we need an event listener like enter, so we can add the to-do item to the to-do list, because we really don't have any submit button, right? And then we can see the other requirements. So we have a list of to-dos, we should be able to check them, uncheck them, remove them. We even have filters below how many of them are left. So we really need to think about the requirements. So the requirements for the to-do app are being able to enter and submit a to-do item, mark a to-do item is completed, edit a to-do item, remove a to-do item, show how many uncompleted to-do items are left, and then we can filter them by all active and completed and clear the completed to-do items. So requirements give you a clear goal and bring up questions and show potential problems. Questions move you forward to a solution. Your projects fail because there's no scope and you abandon it after you get bored or the level of complexity explodes and you really don't know where to go after that, right? So this gives you control how little or how much you want to do inside the project and gives you a clear goal when the project is finished, right? And this is really awesome. So let's look at the second method, which is breaking down the problem. So don't just look at the finished project, like the example of a to-do list, because you're going to get quickly overwhelmed. Break down the problem into atoms or other smaller problems or tasks you can do. Every project started with one line of code, right? And you should ignore the window dressing. If you want to recreate something, you should strip its styles and everything else that's really distracting, right? So for example, if we look at to-do MVC, which is really awesome, so we can say to-do 1, to-do 3, and to-do 4. So for example, we can check it, uncheck it. This might look really complicated because it has a lot of window dressing, right? But it's really not that bad. So for example, if I go to inspect it and I can go here, don't worry if it's tiny. So this is inside an iframe. So if I go to the head, I can find the styles and I can just remove the styles. Really not that scary when you remove the difficulty or that window dressing. So you can see it's just basically some HTML and JavaScript logic, but you're going to get there one step at a time. So moving forward, a big question a lot of people have, and there's really good intention advice when someone tells you should work on projects, and that's really great, but how much is enough when it comes to get started working on projects, right? So how do you know if you know enough JavaScript to get started working on projects? And the answer is you should first learn fundamentals, of course, and that's really irrelevant if you watch a course, a video series, or a crash course on JavaScript. And the only way you're going to know what you have to learn and get that answer is through working on projects, because it's going to show the holes in your knowledge. Otherwise, you can go through years of learning JavaScript or HTML, CSS, and whatever, and you're not going to get anywhere because you need to grind that experience, right? So this is really the simplest answer I can give you. So you can spend years learning about one thing, and this is the trap of learning for sake of learning. You might enjoy learning about new things, and that's fine, but if you want to progress somewhere, then you need to avoid this trap. So avoid it because you're going to be more excited to learn about something. And this is why really I don't believe in the order of having to learn things such as HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, because you can always go back and learn what you have to, right? So your learning never stops, and that's the biggest takeaway you should take. And the problem with learning everything is you're going to be bored and you're more likely to quit. But if you just work on something and struggle, and then you go back and you can say, so this is why I'm learning this, so I can apply it on my own project. And once you understand that, you're going to be over the moon excited because you're going to understand why you're learning, right? And it's going to help you solve a problem. And also, learning is a marathon and not a race. And I see this mistake often. Someone thinks, I just need to finish this course and I'm done. Wrong. You're going to learn your entire life. This applies to any other skill in your life you're trying to learn, and the same applies to coding. But yeah, break down the problem you're trying to solve into smaller problems and avoid the ones that scare you. And this is really important. You don't have to tackle big, spooky, scary problems, right? Just do the minimum thing and then you can tackle what scares you. Most tutorials are like this. They're shallow and they really don't teach you problem solving because they're limited on time or they want to keep your interest. And I'm not really talking against tutorials because I also make tutorials, but I really want to make you aware that this is how you fall into the trap of being in tutorial hell. So moving forward, you should start simple. In the example of our to-do application, right? What is the first thing you can start with? Just a simple input, right? So do that. Don't think about the entire application or everything you have to do at once. Just start one by one. And even if it becomes unmanageable and spaghetti code, that's awesome because you can just rebuild it. It takes no time and you can apply what you learned previously, right? And don't ever feel like you're wasting your time because tutorials are just a huge dopamine hit to your brain that wants instant gratification. But this is how you actually learn. So you can start simple. And then you can even use comments as pseudocode. So you can say get the elements, you want to store the to-dos, add the event listener, etc. Whatever you can think of. And this can also serve as questions or problems you need to solve on the way. So you go to your search and you can do a search, you can ask a friend or whatever, right? So then we grab the elements, store the to-dos temporarily in memory using an array, right? This is just basic JavaScript. Then we can add an event listener and maybe you type that out in search, how to add an event listener, etc. Key down, and then maybe you search how to do something when you press enter and you're just solving problems one step at a time. Really, none of this isn't important or how you have to do something, but how do you get to that point, which I hope is what you take away from this, right? So moving forward, get your hands dirty. So don't passively consume content. Don't just watch me talk or anyone else and never do anything. Take what you learned, play around with it so it becomes muscle memory and etc. You have to get your hands dirty. And that feeling of feeling uncomfortable means you're learning. But don't get to the stage where you're angry or frustrated with what you're doing and be the type of, if I don't figure this out myself, I'm stupid or etc. No, that is completely wrong. Use every resource at your disposal, but use repetition and do it again from scratch until you understand it yourself. You have to develop muscle memory and you're going to develop pattern recognition. I'm not really sure if you're into esports, but if you're not, how are the 1% of the players in those games? They have amazing mechanics, of course, but they also have incredible pattern recognition from grinding out thousands of games, right? And that's why they're at the top of their game. So I want you to do the same. Repetition is everything. If you don't understand something, start from scratch and repeat doing it because you're going to be less overwhelmed by syntax and can focus on the logic instead. Trying to learn syntax and logic at the same time is equivalent of learning how to play the guitar and sing at the same time. So you need to give it time, and that's why repetition is key. When you're learning, syntax does matter because it gets in your way. You're thinking about nonsense such as where do I put semicolons, how do I put this bracket, etc. because you can't even make the code work, and that's really hard. So just give yourself time and you're going to get there. 5 minutes of practice is better than trying to make up for everything on the weekend and get crushed trying to learn everything at once. So every day, try to practice at least for 5 minutes, and it's going to give you much greater results than trying to cram it all at once, right? And you're going to feel frustrated when you move at a snail's pace compared to following a tutorial, but you're going to learn and grow much faster than farming tutorials because you're exercising your brain, just like going to the gym. If you remember the example I told you about earlier, watching tutorials and not doing anything is really the equivalent of vicariously living through someone else, watching someone else going to the gym and get those gains instead of you. So hit the gym. As you learn and improve at your craft, you're going to start recognizing patterns and be able to learn things quicker because of your past experience. And this is why it's so frustrating when people always complain about the new JavaScript framework, because it doesn't matter. A, businesses don't change their stack overnight. For B, you don't have to learn it unless you want to, right? And C, it's literally solving the same problems and you can pick up anything you want quickly. So yeah, that's always funny to me. You're never going to know everything, but you're going to have confidence you can figure it out. So really don't think if someone is senior, they know the entire world. They just really know how to Google better than you. So identify what makes you feel insecure instead of avoiding it, and use repetition until it becomes second nature. Learn how others write code. Use open source education. What do I mean by this? You can go on GitHub and you can find any repository you want that's open source, and you can learn how the code is written. You should expose yourself to ideas and learn how others solve problems. This is going to be extremely hard at first, but the more you read code, the more you're going to get used to it. Tutorials hide reality. So for example, in most tutorials they teach you how to fetch. You're going to see maybe these 2 lines of code. So we fetch the Pokemon from the API and then we get the response and that's it. But really, the code you might write is something like this. You have to validate if the user passed in the Pokemon. If the Pokemon is a string, then you need to do validation. Then you need to try if the response is going to work even in the first place. If the response is bad, then you have to pass a message, right? And then you need to see if the fetch itself failed, then you need to throw an error. And when you start writing your own applications and you start doing this, you're going to feel like you're almost doing something wrong, even if what you're doing is correct, because tutorials have conditioned you so much into not doing it, right? But really it's not the problem of tutorials, but again, is that problem that you're just using tutorials and really not looking at how code is being written. So reverse engineering and reading docs is the best way to improve at your craft, and with practice it's going to read like poetry. So let me show you another example. If we have an example that is expect, that takes a sum and then it says dot to be expected, can you see the code behind this example? And this is really a fun exercise you can do. When you see something like this, just try thinking how this is implemented under the hood. This is called method chaining, where you can chain methods together one after the other, but this is really not what's important, right? So really, do you see the functions here and the object and how you can chain them together? And this is how you can practice and improve at the code. So if you look at the solution, it's really not that bad. So it's really just a function, expect, where we pass the value, in this case sum, and then it just returns other methods or functions, right? And you can chain whatever you want after this. So we can say to be, and then we can pass in the expected value. Then we can do some check if it equals or doesn't, and that's really it. And this is the basic fundamentals of how a testing library works. And I always thought how jQuery was magic. So if you look at the dollar syntax, this might look like something that's unachievable to you. How can I create this? Like, this looks really complicated. But if you think about it, it's really not different than the last example. So if you look at here, we just have a button click, we have again a function, and the $sign is just a function that takes in an element, and we can query the element, and then we can just return a click that we're going to pass a callback or another function we can execute, right? And inside that click, we can just add an event listener click and call the callback. And we recreated the jQuery code. Of course, I'm not sure if that's how it's implemented in jQuery, but that's really not important. If I wanted to know, I could look at the source code, and that's what I'm trying to convey here. So I hope you're inspired by this. It's going to take you time and practice, but nothing worth pursuing is easy, so always keep that in mind. Think using data structures. This might sound really confusing, and it's really not. So if we think about a problem like an audio player, you might be thinking about the UI, and then you would get confusing how everything works together. Like when you click play on a song, how does it even know to play that song, right? And this is really what can stop you from turning your ideas into code. But you have to think in data structures that are arrays and objects. So how does that audio player look like a data structure? You have to use state. So you have to know if the state is playing, is shuffle on, is repeat on, etc. And then you're going to realize how change in state drives your UI. If you're using a modern JavaScript framework, it's going to make DOM manipulation way simpler for you. So this is what modern JavaScript frameworks solve. When you change state, your user interface gets updated. So let's look at an example of an audio player. A basic audio player should at least be able to play and pause the song, skip or rewind the song, and change the song. So again, instead of being overwhelmed, let's sketch out the idea. So it might look like a complicated piece of machinery because it has a lot of parts, like being able to load and play the audio and changing the song playing, but how does that look represented in your mind? And the best part is that you don't even have to work with audio yet, but you can make the entire player work just by using data structures, state, and logic, right? That means it can be a video player, etc., whatever you want. So if you look at an audio player sketch, we for example can have a song playing index that's a state. We can set it to be 0, and then we can look at our data structure. So how does an audio player look like? It might have an array of objects where every object represents a track. And then since we said it's 0, we can access the array by saying song playing index 0, and that's what's going to be played when you press the play button. And then for the play button, we can notice that it also has a playing state, which is paused, and if it's paused, it's going to display the text play, and if it's playing, then we can show paused, etc. And then here is how we can drive our application with state. So how do we change a song? If you press next, for example, we can increment the song playing index, and we can do the opposite for the previous one. So we can say song playing index -1 and just do it step by step. Yeah, so if I go here, the audio player is just an array representing a playlist where each object represents a song, as I already showed you, right? So state is some value that represents the state of your application. So in the case of the audio player, we can see how we have the audio player, and then we have state, playing state, paused, song playing index. And then in the example how we can use this, we can say, hey, this is an array playlist, get me the song from the song playing index, and then inside the audio that we have, we can press audio play. And that's really it. And this is really an evolution of that idea. So using state, you can drive the UI, so really nothing is changed here, but we can add a pause, we can set the playing state, we can play previous song, play next song, which works by just incrementing or decrementing the index, and then we can say play. And then if we log out the values, if we say play, it's going to say playing track 1, play next song, playing track 2, play previous song, playing track 1, and if we say pause, it's going to say paused. How does an audio player know how to play a song you press play on? This is something that might stump you, and you should just take a step back and write the static HTML first and go backwards and make it dynamic after you understand the solution. So for example, this isn't code we're going to use later. So for example, we can give a button a data index, which is going to be 0, 1, which we can create dynamically, right? And then I just throw a quick on click function, and then we can see we can get the song index from the event target dataset index, and we know what song is playing. And again, now we have that information, we can access the song in the array that we need to. Isolate the problem you have so you don't have to think about the moving parts and focus on solving one problem at a time. Reproducing a problem like this lets you share it with others also when asking for help. And this is, I see, a mistake most people do. They're like, hey, I need a help with something, and then someone says, hey, can you recreate this problem? And they're like, I really can't recreate the entire application. You don't have to recreate the entire application. If you can't recreate the code, then you really don't know what the problem is. So always isolate problems like this and think step by step. So putting this all together, you can see I have an audio player here I made in Svelte, and you can see I implemented all of these things we talked about. So I have a playlist, which is whatever, and then I have some state here, and I love Svelte because it's really close to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So you can see toggle playing, playing state, then we're loading the song so we can use new audio, etc. And this really isn't important, this is just to show you the thought process. And then we need to have some conditionals for playing, play selected song so we don't overreach the playlist index. Then we have pause, previous, next. You can see we can use this template thing that Svelte gives you like this. And then we can play and pause song, so we can play the song. And then we can go to the next one. And then we can pause it. I can just go through the songs. And I have logic in place, so it stops playing if I go, and really we won't get into an error because there's conditionals in place, etc. And this is really just to show you how that works in practice, right? And the example is available to you if you go to the post, so you can learn more about it. And this really isn't that many lines of code, right? So for example, if we look here, it's maybe 88 or 80 lines of code, and this is really just styling. So yeah, I hope you're inspired and have a look at the example. Learn data manipulation. Data manipulation is 99% of what you do. So take some API and build a UI around it. Learn manipulating arrays and objects. The bread and butter of that for you is going to be map, filter, and spread. Spread really is awesome, so you can copy and avoid mutating objects and arrays. You're really not going to use data structures and algorithms in your job. Of course, I don't really want to say it's useless because there's so many different jobs in web development, some might require it. So we can look how spread is really awesome. So we can define a Cavendish banana, and then we can create a ripe Cavendish banana from that by spreading the existing Cavendish banana. Then you can say its color is yellow and the ripeness is ripe. And then we have a banana varieties variable where we give it the Cavendish one. And then usually you would say banana varieties.push, and you can push it in, but we can just spread the existing array banana varieties, and then we can add a new variety of a banana that's a plantain. As I said, solving coding puzzles doesn't reflect your ability as a developer, so don't waste your time and work on projects instead. Use the Pokemon API to build a user interface for some API endpoint. You can loop over the list of Pokemon and show the information for each one inside a card. And if you're stuck on this, don't know how to proceed, just load up a tutorial or whatever. There's a bunch of them on using the Pokemon API and JavaScript or whatever framework you're interested in, right? And once you're done with the tutorial, then do it from scratch yourself until you understand what you're doing. And this is going to teach you a lot of important lessons such as fetching data in JavaScript. It's going to teach you about promises, async await, etc. So you're just going to deepen your knowledge and understanding. So let's talk about learning CRUD operations. So what is CRUD? CRUD basically means create, read, update, delete. And this is why the to-do MVC example is one of my favorite when I'm learning something new, because recreating it shows me everything I want to know about the framework I'm trying to learn. So everything is a CRUD app. If you open Reddit or Twitter, it's basically a fancy CRUD app with a database. Of course, it's oversimplifying it, but basically, once you understand that, you can create basically anything you want, and it's the backbone of everything. And then you can use local storage or a database, and CRUD is really on the front end, it's on the back end for your APIs, right? And it's really something very important. So for the project ideas, if you think a to-do list is boring, which I don't blame you, you can create a content management system for your blog. Maybe you can create a bookshelf app that keeps track of books you've read, you can give it a rating, etc. You can create an app that tracks TV shows and movies you're watching. You can create an exercise app, and this is really an awesome idea because you can just put your sets in or whatever you have. You can have a timer for everyone, and then you don't have to touch it, so you can just follow your exercise regimen, and then you can even implement voice control. So here are some cool project ideas you can try out. If what you're doing solves a problem you have, it's going to be way more engaging and get you hooked into learning. I've probably tried coding a dozen of times and quit every time because it was so boring and I really didn't understand how it can benefit me until I saw the cool things you can do with it. So you should go out there and expose yourself to ideas and what you can do, and that's really going to motivate you, especially if it's going to help you solve a problem you have. Let's talk about reading documentation. So this is really important and scares a lot of people. Bad documentation gives it a bad reputation. Great documentation should be engaging and have a lot of examples. Documentation is always up to date, so even if you're watching a video, you should have documentation open on the side, and this is going to save you hours of frustration when something goes wrong or isn't up to date, so you don't have to hunt down YouTube comments or whatever, because that's really a frustrating part of learning, because videos are so hard to update. And of course, videos and reading documentation complement each other, so take advantage of that. So if you look at the MDN documentation, for example, if we're looking at the map array method, we can see how it explains the callback and the parameters, which you can read more about inside MDN documentation. It also teaches you things you might not hear if you're just watching a quick tutorial. So in the MDN documentation, it tells you when you would use map over something like for each or a for loop, and that's because map always returns an array, and when you're doing something where you don't want to change the output or return an array, you really want to use these other methods. And you can also see more examples of that, and that's why documentation is really awesome, because it supplements your knowledge. So you shouldn't be afraid of it and avoid it. It's going to be tough at first, maybe learning to read it if you're not used to it, but it's going to take some practice and then you're going to be fine. If you find reading MDN hard to grok, you can find a more friendlier version on V3 Schools. Another fantastic documentation resource for JavaScript is the modern JavaScript tutorial that you can always use as reference. And this is really key here, reference, because you're not going to go through everything at once and then you're done, because you're going to reference this for years to come, right? If you're going to be learning JavaScript or whatever else. So don't fall into the trap of having to learn everything because only doing is going to give you experience. Question everything. Asking questions is the fastest way to improve. You need to keep in mind you're not alone, so you should join a Discord or Slack community and you should just ask questions as many as possible. And you should never feel bad about asking questions because anyone that's there is a volunteer and they like helping, and it also helps them solidify what they learned, right? Of course, be cautious and look it up first, and if you can't figure it out or you can't find it, then you can ask your question. Let's really pretend I never did React, and maybe I skipped JavaScript because I really see this a lot. People skip JavaScript, then they start learning a framework like React, and they think something like map is a part of React, so you can loop over things instead of just being JavaScript. So maybe I don't know about array destructuring, and then when I see it for the first time, I would write down, what is this array syntax? Why is HTML in React? How is this really possible? And then you could ask these great questions and you would find out about array destructuring, and that's really just a JavaScript thing and how it's awesome and you can use it in anything else. And then you're also going to learn about JSX and how it works in React from the React documentation if someone links you to it, right? And this is really awesome. So comment every line of code you don't understand and try to understand it. You should also take advantage of social media and places where developers aggregate like Twitter and start following smart people, which is like having a mentor. You can peek into the mind of great developers and ask questions or learn useful tips and tricks and stay up to date. So how do you find those type of mentors? It's really simple. Again, through the content you're watching, consuming, or the sites you're watching articles. Most of the developers have a Twitter, including myself, and you can just follow them there and take advantage of it and use social media to your advantage. And for the last one, write about what you learned. And this is the one most people are hesitant about because they think you really need to have some authority and experience to write about something and explain it, right? But it's really the opposite. By writing, you gain authority and expertise. And that could be by doing a journal or writing a blog post. For that, use dev community, dev2, or use Hashnode. And they're really awesome because they give you a canonical URL, which means you get the SEO juice if you link it to your own blog. And avoid using sites like Medium because they really don't care about developers, you really don't have basic syntax highlighting, and they really lock you to that platform, and I really think it's terrible. So yeah, take advantage of it and don't just think that writing blog posts is something for experts, etc., because it's for everyone. And if you know something more than the other person, you're in the position to be able to teach them something, and that's really right. There are hundreds of posts like this. Why am I typing one? It's because your post is going to be fresh and someone else is going to read it and take advantage of it, and it's going to be helpful to them, and the way you explain something is unique to how someone else might explain it. So here are some writing tips. So really don't try to be smart and think about your audience. So you really want to be clear and concise when you're talking about something, and don't be wordy and etc. And start by creating an outline so you know what you want to write, right? And first, dump your brain on the page. So really ignore formatting and grammar, etc., because you can format it later. And then once you're done, leave it for a day to stew so you can think more about it. You can add or remove things. And if you have trouble with grammar, you can just use Grammarly. That's going to get the low-hanging fruit and really improve your writing. Regardless of what method you use, I hope you learned more about problem solving and are able to use it in your next project. So yeah, I hope this was informative and entertaining. You can go read the post if you want, which has more detail, and thank you for watching. So catch you in the next one.